the most formidable economic, political, and military force the world had ever known. On the eastern frontier, Judea, once known as the Kingdom of Judah, now lay at the crossroads of the many trade routes that brought prosperity to the empire. It is against this background that the man from Galilee comes to preach his message of compassion, salvation, and redemption, heralding the birth of a new religion that would one day sweep the world. It is a noble yet tragic saga that would end in crucifixion for the one known as Jesus Christ. But those who follow and believe in him are determined to tell his story, and so a New Testament emerges.
If you look at the New Testament as a small library, the first part are the four Gospels. The next book is called the Acts of the Apostles. It tells the story from after the death of Jesus up to the arrival of Paul in Rome. Then you have letters, epistles of Paul, letters by other, at least attributed to other members of the early church, and the last book then is the book of Revelation.
The books of the New Testament were originally written in Greek, and the references to the kingdom of God, as preached by Jesus, were often hailed as good news or Godspell, from which the word gospel is derived. But who wrote them? Who was it who kept account of the one proclaimed to be the Son of God?
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are allegedly written by two of the followers of Jesus, Matthew the tax collector and John the beloved disciple, and then two other friends of apostles, Mark, the associate of the Apostle Peter, and Luke, the traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. These are four accounts that were written down near the end of the first century. Scholars debate the dates, but most think that the Gospel of Mark was the first to be written sometime around the year 65 of the Common Era, so about 35 years after Jesus' death. Luke and Matthew being written maybe 15 or 20 years later, sometime around the year 80 or 85. And the Gospel of John probably the last to be written, perhaps around the year 90 to 95. The Gospels themselves don't claim to be written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are anonymous books. The authors chose to keep their identity secret. The titles in our English Bibles, the Gospel according to Matthew, etc., were put on by later scribes. The original authors didn't identify themselves.
Despite an exhaustive search, thus far no original manuscripts of any of the four Gospels have ever been found. Time has claimed them all. But over the years, fragments of early copies have been retrieved from the dust and debris of the ancient world. Climate is a major factor in the preservation of papyrus and parchment writings. Weather and wind have extracted their toll, but as the chroniclers of Christianity spread, they took their writings with them, and it was in Egypt, with its dry heat, that many ancient manuscripts survived. In the 1920s, a tiny, tattered piece of papyrus was dug from the desert sands and sold to two archaeologists in Cairo. Careful examination of the Greek text proved it to be a shredded copy of the Gospel of St. John, written about a century after the crucifixion. It is the oldest fragment of the New Testament ever found. The oldest known fragment of any manuscript containing the words of the Apostle Mark is known as the Chester Beatty Papyrus. It is a copy of a much earlier work and was written at least 2.5 centuries after Mark lived.
And when he had called the people unto him with his disciples, he said unto them, Whosoever will come after me, let him deny himself, and take up his cross, and follow me. Mark 8:34.
One of the great mysteries of the New Testament was first noticed centuries ago. Large portions of the text in the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke were almost identical, leading to the assumption that Matthew and Luke may have copied the works of Mark.
But when Jesus saw it, he was much displeased, and said unto them, Suffer little children to come unto me, and forbid them not, for such is the kingdom of heaven. Mark 10:14. But Jesus said, Suffer little children, and forbid them not to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 19:14. But Jesus called unto him and said, Suffer little children to come unto me, and forbid them not, for of such is the kingdom of heaven. Luke 18:16.
Matthew, Mark, and Luke really share so much in common and read so much alike. Scholars often refer to them as the synoptic Gospels. That is, using a term synoptic, meaning to see alike, to refer to them. And that is because they're very closely related literarily. They're dependent upon one another.
When scholars began to notice and convince themselves that Mark was being copied by Matthew and Luke, they could also notice there were some other texts in Matthew and Luke that were in a somewhat similar sequence and with a similar content. They didn't come from Mark, so they postulated another source. The German scholars who did it called it Quelle, which meant the source, simply. I call it the Q Gospel.
No material evidence for the existence of the hypothetical Q Gospel has ever been found, yet its influence is unmistakable. There are obvious similarities within Matthew and Luke, indicating that the writers may well have taken their material from the mysterious Q source.
One can almost imagine Matthew and Luke independently of one another sitting down with a copy of Mark on one hand and a copy of Q on the other hand, or a copy of some other document on the other hand, and just inserting, saying, supplementing Mark with various teachings of Jesus.
The search for the elusive Q document continues, but few believe it will ever be found. If it did exist, who wrote it? Who was the author of the text that may have influenced both Matthew and Luke? The chances are that we shall never know. A little under half of the New Testament is devoted to the writings of an extraordinary man, a Jew by the name of Saul of Tarsus, later to become known as the Apostle Paul. More than anyone else, he was responsible for spreading the Christian church within the Roman Empire. Long before the Gospels had been written, just 37 years after the crucifixion, Paul had helped to establish Christianity as a new world religion. From being a persecutor of the followers of Christ, his own conversion to the new faith after he experiences a vision of Jesus on the road to Damascus transforms him into a dedicated missionary. This takes him on a series of journeys throughout the empire, where he helps to found congregations and churches. And so begins another important chapter in the creation of the Bible, as Paul begins his prolific letter writing to these far-flung communities.
Paul was apparently successful. He established churches throughout Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, and throughout what is modern-day Greece, Macedonia and Achaia in the ancient world. We don't know how large his congregations were, whether they're just a handful of people or more than that, several dozen. It's difficult to know, but he had some considerable success.
Paul's letters were the first Christian documents ever to have been written, yet the Gospels themselves are ironically silent about them. But his writings would profoundly influence the development of the new Christian faith.
Paul is traveling from city to city in the Roman Empire, founding churches. As he goes to another city, he sends a letter back to previous churches he has founded. His letters, in a way, are the way he maintains presence with his communities. And you have to imagine them not just mailed to a community, but being sent by a messenger secretary who takes them to the community,